Constitutional Review Committee has updated members of Parliament on its progress on the proposed review of Section 25 of the Constitution. 39 public hearings were held in all 9 provinces to give people a chance to air their views on land expropriation without compensation. ENCA's Pilar Disitusa joins us from our Cape Town studio. She attended that particular briefing. Now, Pilar, I mean, a lot of people who watched those public hearings, I'm sure, have a sense of sort of how things went and what's most likely to happen beyond this point. But obviously, it would be interesting to know what the legislators themselves thought of those hearings.
Yes, Vuyo. So that was actually quite a big bone of contention today in Parliament. So we obviously watched those hearings and we saw MPs sort of crisscrossing across the country to canvass the views of ordinary South Africans. And I mean, day to day, day after day rather, we heard people saying that they want this amendment to happen and were substantiating why. But now the numbers have started to come in on what some of the written submissions are saying, and it seems to be at odds with what we actually saw on TV. Now, the first point that was very interesting for me today is, I mean, when we watched those hearings play out, you'd imagine that maybe thousands of people had gotten up and had their say. But when it comes down to it, they estimate that they only got through about 75 people a day, which comes down to about plus minus 2,500 people only. So that's 2,500 people speaking for 55 million. I was taken aback by that number, but it makes sense when you reconcile the fact that they could only get through so many people a day. So now some other numbers that I was saying came up today was there was this preliminary report on what some of the written submissions have said. Now remember, there was that big figure of about almost 800,000 submissions received that we'd heard, and we heard MPs like Floyd Shivambu contesting that, saying, you know, some of them are duplicates and should be scrapped, which is what has happened now. We've so far managed to get through about 150,000 of those submissions, and the numbers that were quite interesting to hear today was that about 90,000 of those are people who are saying that the Constitution and Section 25 of the Constitution rather should not be amended at all, with only 60,000 of those people saying that it should be amended. The others so far were undecided and are people who, for instance, just came forward and said restitution hadn't worked out for them because of ABC, and maybe government should do this differently, but hadn't had a firm opinion on whether the Constitution, that part of the Constitution rather, should be amended. Now, what was interesting about these numbers is while it emboldened some MPs, you know, to say things like, you see a lot of people are actually not in favor of this, and maybe President Cyril Ramaphosa shouldn't have jumped the gun and made the announcement that the ANC will go forward with expropriating land without compensation. Julius Malema actually reminded us that this is not a referendum, and I'd really like us just to take a second to listen to him and what he had to say today in that meeting.
This is a setup. They say to you, this is the number of people who supported this, number of people who didn't support this. Even when you said this is not a referendum. And to show that they are setting us up and they've got a position, that's why their friends here are reminding us, although it's not a referendum, but these are the numbers, these are the numbers say, these are the numbers say. That was the whole idea, to try and seek to create an impression that majority of the submissions do not agree with this. Even when we said numbers do not matter. Why put numbers if numbers do not matter?
But Pilar, why would this be new or surprising? I mean, for the longest time, this has been the case. I remember post-1994, for those of us who were covering Parliament at the time, it was always the case. Interested parties, lobby groups, academics, and experts always put their voices forward because they had the resources and the wherewithal to make submissions. But that has never dissuaded or you know, Parliament from taking the right decisions or from acting in the interests of the broader public. So why is this an issue today?
And that's the point that Julius Malema was making, that we shouldn't be drawn in by these numbers per se and say that they will indicate what Parliament ultimately decides on doing. So I think that was where MPs were arguing today on whether these numbers actually matter or not. And then it also came down to a thing of the independent service provider that is going through these submissions. They want to find out who this, which company that is, who vetted them, who the directors are, what their interests are. And by the end of today's meeting, we had an agreement that that company will actually appear in Parliament next week to present a more solidified interim report on these numbers that they are showing. But just to keep in mind again, there are about 300,000 more submissions that they have to go through before they submit a final report, but they want them to come in as soon as possible to make sure that they aren't unduly focusing on the numbers and are in fact digging deeper into some of the reasons that people have brought up for why they support and don't support, which is the crux of this matter. And some of the reasons that were mentioned today were, so those 90,000 that I mentioned who are against it highlighted things like the loss of foreign investment, the loss of agricultural jobs, some people going as far as to say it's this entire motion is cheap electioneering ahead of next year's election, whereas on the other hand, the people who are for amending the Constitution, as we've heard in those public hearings, are people who say they are landless and need justice to be done, people who claim they are the first people and were the first people on land in South Africa and need it back. So I don't think there was any movement in terms of getting closer to their final report back today, but it was just to get down to the technicalities of what are our next steps. And the immediate next steps, like I said, is to have that service provider coming in to present a more solidified report that goes deeper into the reasoning for the reasoning behind some of the written submissions. We then have to set out a week to hear a few more oral submissions that will go along with some of those written ones. And then from there, they have until the 20th of September to work on a final report that they will present in the National Assembly.
Okay, Pilar, let's leave it there for now. Thanks very much for your time. She attended that meeting, Constitutional Review Committee meeting, where the committee was updating members of Parliament on the progress made on the proposed review of Section 25 of the Constitution, following, of course, those public hearings.